Welcome back to Alberta Primetime. Our provincial government is taking a lot of budget bashing from several social sectors. What do financial minds think about the cuts, the borrowing, and the money coming in? Jane Alm is a senior investment advisor with Angus Watt Advisory and National Bank Financial. Todd Hirsch is senior economist at ATB Financial. And Shafik Hirani is senior executive financial advisor with Investors Group Calgary. Good evening, everyone.
Good evening.
Good evening.
Hello.
Todd, the Alberta government predicted 2.9% economic growth this year in our province. It's counting on job creation, consumer spending, population growth, 68,000 new Albertans to keep money flowing into its coffers. What do you think of that side of its revenue plans?
Well, I actually think it's pretty reasonable. And what I've been sort of tracking, economic growth in Alberta, it is going to feel softer this year than it's felt like maybe in 2011 or even last year. But right around 2.5–3% is where I see the province. But a lot of places in the industrialized world would love growth at around 2.5% or 3%. So I think their forecast is actually quite reasonable. And I do think it'll be the non-energy sectors of the economy, notably agriculture and some other non-energy resources like forestry, that will be real drivers of the economy this year.
Jane, the Redford government banked on too high bitumen prices in last year's budget. They're more moderate this year when it comes to energy royalties. In contrast, though, to Premier Ralph Klein's Finance Minister Iris Evans, who was only criticized for lowballing revenue projections on energy. Albertans really have seen it all now in 10 years. Too high, too low, in the middle. What do you think of where we're at now?
Well, I think, it becomes very difficult to try to choose where you think that oil will be over a period of, 12 weeks, let alone 12 months. The price of oil, the price of natural gas has a lot of volatility in it, especially with everything that's happening around the world. When we look back 10 years ago, we didn't necessarily have some of the unrest that we see in the Mideast. We didn't have Hugo Chavez passing away. We didn't have China growing on the pace that it's been growing, and that can either be slower or faster depending on what's going on. So I think it's probably become much more difficult to forecast where the price of oil is going to be. The other thing is, 10 years ago, 8 years ago, the Canadian dollar was not near parity, which it is now, which has a huge impact, not on necessarily when you look at the price of oil, but on what our producers actually get in their pockets.
Shafik, the long-term energy revenue forecasts are also based on Keystone XL, the pipeline being built. Is it smart to factor that in? Will we see a lasting discount on the price of Alberta crude for our province?
Yeah, that's the that's the billion-dollar question, Jennifer. I don't know if you want to factor in with certainty that Keystone's going to go, but they've done all their due diligence. There's only a 70-day wait for now President Obama to approve it. Lobbyists and interest groups can now formulate rebuttals, but you want to expect the percentage of approval, and it does look like there's a good chance it'll go through. To the second part of your question, that's the most important one, is because there's a big discrepancy between Western Texas Intermediate and Western Canadian Select. That's what Albertans get for their bitumen, and that's about 30% or $28 on the barrel. And to say that this is going to go down or up is you have to make an assumption. I personally think the disparity is going to continue, and it's going to be harder because all these governments, all these interest groups, they have invested enormous money into infrastructure, into building this, so they now have to unload this oil and they'll force it at lower rates.
Todd, what are your thoughts on the energy side of how the budget's configured?
Yeah, well, you never want to put, obviously, too many of your eggs in one basket, and there's a danger we could be putting too much into the Keystone XL pipeline. To Shafik's point, it does look these days a little bit more positive that it will be passed, but even if it isn't passed, I think there are enough other alternatives. If it's shipping by rail, reversing some of those natural gas pipelines, that I think Alberta bitumen will find its way to markets eventually. But I do agree we need to plan on that differential, that bitumen bubble, hanging around a little bit longer, plan on that. And then if in fact it narrows, that's a benefit. But you don't want to plan on it narrowing.
Jane, Albertans also facing no new taxes in the budget, but one of the political panelists here on Alberta Primetime during our budget coverage Thursday was pointing out how long will government spending, which is now propped up by borrowing, how long will it be sustainable without some sort of revenue injection?
Well, and that's the $50 billion question. I mean, we had said earlier on an earlier panel, you asked what we thought they should do, and I know I said, put in a provincial sales tax, a small one, bring back healthcare premiums, those will all generate revenues. We have to remember that we are adding another city of Red Deer, city of Lethbridge, that many people every year. So that means schools, hospitals, senior facilities, roads, sewers, and it has to be paid for somehow.
We can't wait for the next boom.
We can't wait 10 years to be able to finance it out of cash.
Shafik, we've talked a lot about the Bank of Canada trying to warn Canadians and fiscal policy makers about spending more than they're taking in, the household debt issue, and now Alberta, a bastion of conservative budgeting, borrowing money, running a deficit. It's a bit of a new culture for this province.
Yeah, absolutely. It's a bit of an irony that the government's saying balance your budget, the average Albertans, when the budget's running the Albertan government's running a budget deficit. But yeah, I think it's really important that as Albertans, you want to balance your budget, and Albertans are the highest debt province in Canada, but the average Albertan seems to got their stuff together. Our income is on fire. We got the highest average income per capita. We have excellent unemployment, about 4% unemployment. We have, like Todd mentioned earlier, we have a 4% growth rate. The budget deficit itself is an Alberta issue, and it's not an Alberta revenue issue. It's an Alberta government expense issue, and they need to control the expenses. That would be the message to the Alberta government.
Todd, on budget day, I heard Labour, education, opposition leaders, all kinds of people in the legislature complaining about a bloated middle and upper management bureaucracy in government. We don't hear much about whether that's true or not. What kind of accountability should Albertans expect and perhaps be given about potential waste in that area?
Well, I think absolutely government needs to be accountable, just like private sector needs to be accountable. And I think it's important people realize this is never just a government issue. In the private sector, you look at the big companies, they're always trying to fight back what people say is bloat or, fat, that efficiencies that we can gain. So it's not just the government, but absolutely we need to expect our government to be accountable. The only danger, I think, in talking a whole lot about it is that some people can tend to believe that, we can find $6 billion in savings by trimming some management levels. No, you can't do that. Absolutely, we need to be looking for more streamlined, more efficient spending of government, of our tax revenues. But it's a myth to believe that you can find 15% savings just by trimming some fat.
Next up, what else our Monday Money panelists have their eyes on this week? And what is your vacation budget? The big difference between Albertans and other Canadians, with some expert advice on how much you should spend for that holiday.
Hair care services for Jennifer Martin provided by Charisma Hair Fashion.
Welcome back to Alberta Primetime and our Monday Money panel. We've looked at the budget. What else are you watching this week? We'll start with you, Todd.
Well, Stats Canada actually doesn't have a whole lot of new releases out this week. Last week was sort of the bigger week for economic news. But I'm going to be watching the value of the Canadian dollar, both for selfish reasons, because I am going to be visiting Asia as a tourist coming up. So I'd like the dollar a little stronger. But I'm also kind of interested to see why the Canadian dollar is a little bit soft right at the moment. It's kind of going in a different direction than what I had thought.
About 97 cents?
Yeah, about 97 cents, and it's just a little bit softer than what I thought it would be. So actually, over the next few weeks, I'm going to be watching where the loonie goes.
Jane, you're also watching U.S. banks and, of course, always China, a big driver for Alberta's economy.
Yeah, and there's something happening in China right now that happens about once every 10 years. We know that the new government was put in at the beginning of the year, but they're actually taking power this week. So they're starting to announce some of the changes, and those changes could affect Albertans and investments around the world. One of the changes that came out this weekend was that they're going to dismantle their railway monopoly, the people that are running it. Their budget for the railway is the size of the budget of Denmark.
Wow.
So there's a lot of money there. There's 83 billionaires in the new Congress of China. So they're trying to get rid of some of the graft and some of the corruption. So we're watching to see how that goes. As far as the U.S. banks, they had their stress test last week. This week we should get the announcement of who gets to raise their dividends, who gets to do share buybacks, what kind of values those are. If the numbers come in where there's some expectation, you could see the U.S. bank stocks move higher. And that means higher dividends, could mean higher dividends across the board.
Shafik, Japan's top banker's speech. Why do we need to care about that?
Yeah, this is really big news, and it's not really getting enough attention, in my opinion. Japan has promoted a new monetary policy leader, Haruka Furuta, and he is now giving a speech on Thursday, and he's expected to announce some really aggressive measures to reduce the Japanese yen, some really inflationary measures to print more yen. And if you look at the Japanese currency, since he's been announced into power over the last 3 months, the yen has dropped 20%. And this is a very good, it could be considered a warning sign that Japan's economy is not going to do well, but it also could be a very good buying opportunity if your Canadian dollars you want to put to work. And you shouldn't just put your Canadian dollars into Alberta stocks. Canada represents 2% of the world. Alberta represents only a small fraction of that. It's really good for Albertan investors to diversify. Japan could be an opportunity to buy right now. And
new housing price indexes coming out from Stats Canada.
Yeah, that's on Friday, and that's also pretty good. You know, Canada has been on fire, and I know TD Bank. I was talking to your producer Steve in the right before that we went on, and you know, the Canadian prices have been high. There's an announcement by TD that real estate prices could go down. So that we're keeping out. Those numbers are out by Stats Canada on Wednesday.
Before we get into a new house, how about a plane? March break is days away, and a recent CIBC survey shows Albertans are the most likely to take a March break vacation. 12% of Canadians planning a getaway, but 17% of Albertans ready to jet off. Most Canadians looking to spend about $2,600 on a spring break vacation. Todd, are Albertans taking vacations more so than other Canadians because of their higher incomes, the weather? Is it becoming an expected right rather than a luxury?
Well, it might be all those. It might also be some demographics, too. We've got the youngest population in Canada, and young people do tend to travel a little bit more, even if they're shorter vacations, maybe to Mexico. But I think the biggest key variable here is income. Albertans are still making about 19% more than they are in the Canadian average. So people here, a lot of people here, have the money to travel.
Jane, if you haven't maxed out your RSP contributions, should you be spending $3,000 on a vacation?
Well,
Can you do both?
you have to be able to figure out how to have some balance in your life, because yes, you have to save for retirement, you have to save for the future, but no one knows what the future will hold, what your health will be, so you need to have balance. You also need to have memories with your family, so they're both very important. I wouldn't want to see somebody say, I'm not going to put anything into my RSP and go on this giant holiday and
on a credit card,
credit card, you know, or increase their mortgage or whatever. But to allow yourself to have time with your family is oh so important.
A little bit of both. We can swallow that medicine. Thank you all for your time tonight. Jane Elm is a senior investment advisor with Angus Watt Advisory, National Bank Financial. Todd Hirsch is senior economist at ATB Financial, and Shafik Hirani is senior executive financial advisor with Investors Group Calgary.